Thanks very much, Ian. I did write a few things down, but most of them have been said by Ian today. I, of course, also want to acknowledge the traditional owners, elders past, present and future, and any here with us today. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Thanks, Chandran and Politics in the Pub for having us along. Thanks, Lee, for not being able to make it. I get to have your presence. I haven't got quite as good a hair as Lee Rhiannon, but... Sorry? I'm sure she would rather be here. So my name is Tim O'Connor. I have the privilege and pleasure, I guess, of working with the Refugee Council of Australia. Has anyone heard of the Refugee Council?
Yes.
That's good. That's good. So we're... Oh, good on you, Jeff. It's great to have you here too. Jeff's one of my heroes.
Who was your predecessor, Margaret Piper?
True, yeah, I do remember Jeff. And in regular touch with Margaret. But the Refugee Council is the peak body. We have about 200 member organisations across the country, organisations that work with and for refugees and asylum seekers, both here in Australia and in offshore detention and also internationally. The topic tonight is Australia's shame, and of course it is an enormous shame. The last few years have been an incredible blight, I think, on Australia's reputation. But also, we should remember before that, things had actually changed. Kevin Rudd, who's the one who reinstituted mandatory offshore detention, so sending all these people off to Manus and Nauru, was actually the guy that closed it down in 2009. And I think it is a shame the policy we are in now, but it can change. We should also remember the Canadian situation. They had Stephen Harper as their leader just a few years ago, and he was very much the equivalent of Tony Abbott. They had a change of government and Trudeau came in, and now Canada is the toast of the world in terms of its acceptance of refugees. So things can change, but at the moment it's incredibly difficult. And being in touch with quite a number of the people on Manus and Nauru, it's incredibly harrowing. It's horrifying when Peter Dutton, the Immigration Minister, says people like me and people like Ian. Ian was picked out in the Sydney Morning Herald by Peter Harcher last week as being one of these architects of people telling them to stay there. We're not doing that. We're not telling people to stay there. That's absolutely insane. We want these men brought to safety, and we've always wanted that. But we also shouldn't forget the people on Nauru, because the focus often shifts around. There's still more than 1,000 people on Nauru, half of them women and children, who we've also sent to that country as well. So I'm going to talk a bit tonight about the duality, I guess, at the heart of Australia's approach to refugees and the real perversity, and pick out some of the kind of recent examples that we've seen. And it often gets overshadowed that there is an incredibly successful refugee story in Australia. We are probably the best country in the world when it comes to resettling refugees. We have a fantastic system that countries like Canada, who do it particularly well now, and in places like Denmark and Sweden, they've come and looked at what we do. When a refugee comes for Australia, someone that is selected, often through the UNHCR, but more often lately, particularly through some kind of family connection they have here, they're met at the airport by a refugee resettlement organisation that's funded by the government. They get taken to a house, they get a bit of short-term accommodation initially, they get their kids enrolled in school, they get access to healthcare and welfare benefits, they get opportunity for job training. All those things could be improved, but many of them are very good, and certainly at least equivalent to anywhere else in the world. And of course the other side of that is these incredibly perverse discriminatory policies that we have that target people seeking asylum, particularly if they come by boat. And the focus, in the last couple of weeks has been on Manus, but we shouldn't forget there's 30,000 people living in our community today who are virtually, treated as fourth, fifth class people. They don't have the same rights that any other person in this country does have. They can't access, education in many cases. They don't have access to Centrelink benefits. They're only surviving on the goodwill of the Australian people. I'm sure many of you are involved in supporting some of those people too. But you'll remember back in, I think it was 2000, when did John Howard get kicked out? Can anyone remember back that far?
Kicked out, 2007.
2007 was it? Yes, yeah. I thought someone might be able to remember that.
Kevin 07.
Yes, Kevin 07 came in. But at the time, I mean, John Howard actually got the vast majority of those people who were on Nauru and Manus back in 2004. The Australian Human Rights Commission, many other organisations were raising a very big campaign around, particularly focused on kids in detention. The Human Rights Commission did a fantastic report on that. And then, Howard initially came out, didn't like the report very much, but those kids and all those people who were on Nauru and Manus were evidently resettled. Some of them went to New Zealand, some of them went to Canada, a few of them went to Europe, but the vast majority of them ended up in Australia. Howard brought more than 640 of those people to this country, and they're living here amongst us now, contributing to our society. It's something we shouldn't, I think, forget that it can happen. But of course, Rudd, when he got elected, closed down the detention centres, closed down Nauru and Manus, and then just a few years later, got the knives in the back from Gillard, and a few years after that took the knives out and then knifed Gillard again. And he reinstituted offshore detention. And it's a stain that continues. The perversity of that, I think, is profound. Rudd has been out in the media recently saying that part of the agreement he had, the MOU he had with Papua New Guinea, was that those people would only be there for 12 months. If you read the MOU, which I have a number of times looking for it, it doesn't say that at all in that MOU. It was not designed to be, by Kevin Rudd, not designed to be something of a short-term nature. Sure, they were going to look for other options, but they didn't have any options on the table, and it's clear this government has done very little in getting sustainable options on the table as well. Ian talked about the Cambodia deal, $55 million. We gave to Cambodia to set this deal up. 5 people resettled to that country. Only one of them remains in Cambodia, and of course Cambodia, the opposition leader's recently been detained. There's an election coming up there. The opposition leader's been detained, and Australia hasn't said a thing about it. Because basically what we've done with this stupid deal we put in place is we've silenced our ability to actually engage with our neighbours on fundamental human rights principles. Totally perverse. I don't know if any of you were watching Senate estimates a couple of weeks ago. For my sins, I have the privilege of doing that, and the wonderful Michael Pizzullo, the head of the Immigration Department, which soon will be Homeland Security, which we're extremely excited about. He was, I think it was Senator Kim Carr was asking him about the Operation Sovereign Borders and how many boats had arrived, and Pizzullo said that none had arrived since the government had come into place, since the Abbott government had come in. 31 boats had been turned back, and they had about 700 people on them. They're the ones that the government tells us about. We don't really know how many boats have been turned back, and we don't know the fate of any of those people who have been turned back. But then Carr had another example of 6 Chinese people who'd washed up on Sabai Island. So anyone knows Sabai Island is actually an island of Queensland. Its postcode, I think, is 4785, very clearly an Australian area. 6 people had washed up. There was a people smuggler who was steering the boat for them at the time, but this was not considered a boat arriving in Australia. And there was this bizarre sort of double speak that went on, where it's because it washed up on that part of the country and didn't come from Indonesia or Sri Lanka, then it wasn't considered a boat arriving. This is a kind of bizarre, perverse situation that we're in.
Are they rich?
Well, we don't know the fate of them. They said they've been turned back, so I couldn't possibly say.
So where'd they come from?
They came from China. That was 6 Chinese, people looking to come to Australia. But of course, that route has been open for many, many thousands of years. There's been trade occurring across there, and boats and people coming all the time. Again, it's just an indication of the kind of perverse situation that we've got ourselves into. I guess another one of the examples is this situation that we have on Manus now. I mean, Australia, a member of the UN Human Rights Committee, as people may know, where we committed to stand up for the rights of women and children, many of whom are still on Nauru, as I said, where we committed to support national institutions of human rights. I mean, has anyone seen the attacks that this government has taken vengeance upon the Human Rights Commission, particularly under Gillian Triggs? Totally perverse situation. But also they didn't have a plan. This idea to close down Manus on the 31st of October was something that the Australian government had said must happen. Court decision occurred in April last year, which found that it was unconstitutional in the PNG constitution to detain people who had committed no crime, and they were being detained indefinitely in this sort of legal grey zone between the contractors, between Papua New Guinea, between the Australian government who funds it all. Well, actually, we fund it all as Australian taxpayers, of course. And nothing was done. It's clearly nothing was done. The UNHCR was up there this week, or late last week, saying that the centres that were going to move these men to, they didn't have sufficient beds to house the 600 men who were in the Manus Detention Centre. That the centres were half built, that the toilet facilities weren't in place. There was still heavy machinery on the property. And we understand that's still the situation today. Again, just another indication of the insanity, the total perversity of the situation we've got ourselves into. Because there are real clear options for those men who are on Manus. They could, some of them obviously have been resettled to the US, and again, a totally bizarre deal. Refugees being sent from Australia, ostensibly, to the United States of America. It's absolutely bizarre. And as Ian said, there's a lot of concern from many of the people on Manus and Nauru about going to the States and the rise of, the anti-Muslim sentiment, which is sort of running rampant there at the moment. There's enormous concern about that amongst the group. Still, they're saying that the US will take in 1,250, but there's been no real agreement around that at all. And our conversations with the US Embassy here don't give us any faith that any more people will be resettled. One of the things Donald Trump has done is cut the US refugee resettlement quota. So last year it was 89,000, this year that'll be cut in half. So they're only accepting half the number of refugees that they were in the past. And with very significant humanitarian crises in places like Syria, still people flooding into Lebanon, more than 1 million people have left South Sudan over the last 12 months, very big humanitarian crisis. It's very unlikely, or it's likely, I think, that we won't see too many more people go from PNG or Nauru to the US. But New Zealand, back in 2013, they said they would take 150 refugees from Nauru and Manus every year. That's 600 people that could have been very quietly moved off. And again, an example of this kind of legal grey zone that exists here is Australia says that these refugees and people seeking asylum are actually Papua New Guinea's problem now, even though we're funding it all. But Australia says that the Papua New Guinea can't send those refugees to New Zealand, but we're not in control. It's totally perverse. But we could have had 600 of those people on New Zealand now, and they could be starting to rebuild their lives. Instead, they're being, what Amnesty calls tortured on Nauru and Manus. There's also hundreds of people who are in our offshore detention centres who have family connections in places like the US and Canada and Sweden and Denmark. They could be reunited with their family. There's been one example of that. We worked on a case a couple of years ago where a family who'd fled Aleppo in 2012, the mum and 4 of the kids got separated. They were in a refugee camp for a couple of years. They were resettled to Canada. The father and son ended up being locked up on Nauru. They came to Australia. It took over 2 years to get those families reunited. Even though the Canadian government worked incredibly hard on our end, the Australian government tried to stop them in every way. There's plenty of options for hundreds more people to be resettled to countries like Canada. There was also just this week, I'm not sure if you saw it on the 7:30 report or it was out in the media, an incredibly articulate young man called Mir Taginia talked to us a couple of years ago about his potential options. He'd met a worker on Manus who was involved in an immunisation program that he'd got involved with, and the immunisation program was incredibly badly set up. He made the thing work, that basically the vaccines were a long way away from where the actual people that needed to be vaccinated were, and there was no mechanism to get them together. So he made that whole thing work. He met this immunisation worker who was based in Australia, originally Canadian. Her parents were Australian Canadian. They've moved back to Canada and have sponsored Amir to go there. So just last week, as Peter Dutton cut off the water, the food, the medicines, many of these men who are on Manus are on, they have serious psychological issues from the sorts of stresses they've suffered before they got there, but also the ones they've suffered since they've been there. All those medications have been cut off.
They've been moved out in 2 days, according to the 6 o'clock news.
That's what the Papua New Guinean government is saying, that they've got 48 hours until they'll be forcibly removed.
So what are they expecting to do just out there with those supports?
You should probably ask Peter Dutton that. But I guess that what I'm trying to say is that people like Amir, who is now resettled in Canada, is another one of the examples of the options that are available if Australia was really serious about this. And because there are all these options on the table and Australia hasn't taken them up, I mean, it really suggests there's another agenda at play here.
Yes.
What is Dutton's agenda here? What is Malcolm Turnbull's agenda? Why are we keeping these people suffering? I mean, there is a view that, you know, it's a very cynical view, that it suits them, that it suits their politics to have these people there. And also that it will, you know, when they look like they will lose government, they're certainly not doing too well in the polls or with the Constitution, that they will be able to leave this, you know, festering sore for the ALP to be able to deal with. I guess the other important thing to think about is what the current policy that Australia's put in place has really done is it builds a virtual wall. So what Donald Trump wants to build a wall in Mexico, but what we've done is build a virtual wall where we're pushing people back. And I think the greatest tragedy, of course, this is damaging thousands of people's lives, and that is a horror. It is costing us, it costs, you know, to keep one person on Nauru Manus for 1 year, the Australian National Audit Office found, it costs $573,111. I mean, we could be sending these people to Oxford and it would be cheaper than that. So it's costing us as Australian taxpayers an enormous amount of money. It's doing incredible damage to our international reputation. But also the world at the moment faces a humanitarian displacement crisis. There's 65 million people, you know, 2.5 times the population of Australia, of people have been forced out of their homes. The population of Australia, and, you know, nearly 24 million now, are recognised as refugees. Last year in the world, the number that were permanently resettled to countries like Australia or the US or Canada or Denmark or Sweden, etc., was 189,000. So it's a tiny number that ever get resettled. And, you know, our argument is very much the current policy is stopping us actually dealing with the root of the problem. So when 500,000 people who fled from, you know, Rohingya, who fled out of Burma in recent weeks across the border to Bangladesh, but when they get to Bangladesh, they can't send their kids to school, they can't get access to healthcare, they can't even work. So what Australia should be doing is working with governments like Bangladesh to be able to support them to get access to those things. We need to ensure that people can flee, absolutely, when their safety is under threat. But we need to ensure that they can live with dignity when they get to the countries they flee to. I worked in, you know, Lebanon, I've worked in Jordan on the back of the crisis coming out of Syria. And it's the same situation there. When they get across the border, it's a huge relief and they feel safe. But then they're forced with this enormous challenge of actually surviving, of actually trying to build a new life. And when you can't send your kids to school and they get a cold and end up getting incredibly sick and dying, and then, you know, you realise you can't earn any money, you've got to, you know, that's why we saw such an exodus of men moving into Europe a couple of years ago, because they realised that was the only way they were going to get enough money to keep their families alive. So if we're actually using those billions of dollars we're wasting on torturing people in Nauru and Manus at the root cause of the problem, we're actually doing much better in trying to stop the boats as our government is so fixated with. So I won't go on any longer, but thanks very much for listening.